Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Art Museum of Southeast Texas. My name is Caitlin Clay, and I'm the Curator of Exhibitions here at Sunset. And I would like to introduce our first speaker, which is Noelle Miriam. She is our Executive Director.
Everyone, it's so fantastic to have all of you here tonight for this very special exhibition, starting off our 75th anniversary celebration. You're going to have such a great time seeing all of the artwork here because this exhibition brings to life the story of the early years of the Beaumont Art Museum, which is now the Art Museum of Southeast Texas. And all of our exhibitions would not be made possible without all of our supporters. And this particular exhibition has received support from the Texas Commission on the Arts, the City of Beaumont, the Helen Caldwell Locke and Curtis Blakey Locke Charitable Trust, the Wesley W. Washburn, MD, and Lulu L. Smith, MD, Endowment Fund, the Edith Fuller Chambers Charitable Foundation, Beaumont CBB, Jefferson County, and the members of our museum. Thank you so much. Our programs and exhibitions would not be possible without you. And now I will turn it over to the curator of the exhibition, Caitlin Clay.
Thank you so much, everyone. I would also like to add some additional personal thank yous, not only to our exhibition underwriters who make all of our exhibitions and programming possible, but also to Brendan Williams, one of our board members who helped me with some of the logistics for the show, Christie's Corner, one of our local businesses who helped make the foam core signs that you'll see throughout the exhibition, the gallery manager, Matt, at the Art League, and the Art League itself, who allowed me to look at the last minute through their archives, which I really appreciated. And then, of course, all of my fellow staff members who do so much to help bring our exhibitions together. It really is a team project, and so I appreciate you all as well. So, some of our themes for tonight. This exhibition celebrates and kicks off our 75-year anniversary, which we are so excited to spend the next year or so celebrating through our exhibitions and our programs. It looks at 37 years of history throughout the show. So some of you who have walked through the exhibition will have already seen that it is divided up into different rooms, and each room represents a decade from 1950 to 1987. And this exhibition was put together using the permanent collection, so artworks that are owned by the Art Museum. We actually own over 1,700 objects, if you can believe it. We do a really good job of storing them away and then bringing them out when it's necessary to exhibit them. In addition, some of our themes are community, connection, culture, and creativity. You will see these four themes throughout the story that I tell tonight about the history of the museum. And to quote the fabulous Mark Twain, you will hear that history does not repeat itself, but it does often rhyme. So by the end of this exhibition, you will notice a lot of through lines between what's going on today in our community, as well as what was happening in the late 1980s. All of the information from tonight's exhibition comes from scrapbooks in the museum's archives from 1950 to the 1980s. The museum is so lucky that they've sort of assigned a volunteer to collect newspaper clippings and handouts, and then they were very diligent in chronologically keeping those items in scrapbooks. And so for any of you who've been back to my office, it's just filled with boxes of scrapbooks right now. There's scrapbooks everywhere in this museum. Because of that, I relied on the scrapbooks as my primary sources for the information in this exhibition. However, I know there are still many people who had lived experience of the years of the Beaumont Art Museum, and we would be delighted if you would like to share with us your experiences, your photographs, any wonderful memories that you have. At this time, we'll rely on you contacting me, and my information is at the front desk, but in the future, we will provide another means for you to be able to submit that information to us. Okay, so speaking a little broadly about the permanent collection, you will hear me tonight refer to the artworks as acquisitions. Acquisitions talk about artworks that have been brought into the holdings of that organization or that institution. So if the museum acquires an artwork, we can do that through several means. We can either do it through a donation, where an artist or a collector gives the artwork to us, or we can purchase the artwork from an artist or a collector or a state. So those are a couple ways that we may acquire artworks. In particular, the museum decided to begin acquiring artworks through jury competitions, where they would offer cash prizes to the artists. And so in the 1950s, that was their first means of going about getting artworks that they could own, but also hold in the community's trust and exhibit on sort of a regular basis. Okay. So we're going to go chronologically through the exhibition, and there's going to be a little bit of information that you may have not read or listened to, but I do encourage you to please go through and read the wall tags, read the labels, listen to the audio. This is one of our first exhibitions to have audio components, and so we're very pleased to offer that interpretive material for you in this exhibition. So how does the Beaumont Art Museum get started? We have to go all the way back to the 1940s. In the 1940s, there was sort of the perfect storm going on in Southeast Texas. In particular, there was a lot of social clubs, beginning with a women's social club. And these women were very interested in the arts. Some of them were artists themselves, some of them wanted to learn about art and practice art. And so there were people who were already making pieces because it was their own artistic practice. And then there were people who were learning from those artists, who were taking classes because they wanted to support the arts and learn more about it. During that time, about 30 local artists got together and they joined together to create the Beaumont Art League, which is our actually oldest art establishment in Southeast Texas. And they decided, wow, wouldn't it be nice if we had like a physical space, a proper museum, where we could put on exhibitions and we could display works of local artists and local collections, as well as bring in art from outside of the area. And so Mrs. Hoffman, who was one of the Art League members, decided that they would have a canasta and bridge tournament in the early 1950s in order to raise money. That was their form of fundraising. And the artists got together and they offered either artworks as prizes, or they offered the opportunity to have an artwork made like a commission, so you could get your portrait done if you selected that artist as your prize. And together, they raised $331. And I say, that's not a lot of money, but we've got to put that into the calculator, right? And so that's $4,430 in 2025 time. And so within 2 weeks of having the tournament, and then the next thing happening, they rented a house, they refurbished it, they created a board of directors, they hired a staff of 14 instructors to teach 23 art classes. And then they opened. On July 16, 1950, the Beaumont Art Museum and School opened at 1035 Calder Avenue, which was a rented house. And now, you may say, oh, I'll drive down Calder Avenue and look for that. Unfortunately, the house is no longer there, and it's where two amigos mechanic shop is. They're not viewing. However, there is a wonderful illustration of the house that is on this back wall, my left, your right, so you can always get sort of a sense of what that house looks like. But I couldn't believe it, that in 2 weeks, they really put together all the money that they needed, all the instructors, and I think it was because for a long time they had been thinking about this being a project they wanted to complete, and when they had the opportunity, they really moved quickly on making it happen. So on September 14th, 1950, just a few months later, the museum is formally incorporated, and that is the date we are using for celebrating our 75th anniversary. And the initial objectives of the museum were to promote interest in the arts, show the representative work of members, sponsor one-man shows and traveling exhibits of distinction, promote a Southeast Texas show in the spring, and that's going to be important later, and arrange loan exhibits of local collections. And I'd like to just preface here that, again, many of the early founders and movers and shakers of the Beaumont Art Museum were Beaumont Art League members. And so the organizations were separate from each other as like technical entities, but they were very closely entwined with one another. So you could have a membership with the Art League and have a separate membership with the Art Museum. But most of the time, the people who were the board of directors and also exhibiting at the museum were Art League members. Okay, so we're incorporated in 1950. 2 years later, we start to see that Southeast Texas show in the spring come together. So in May 1952, they offered the first annual exhibition of the Beaumont Art Museum for residents of Texas. Very long time. They offered $750 in prizes, which is equal to over $9,000 in 2025. And luckily, in our permanent collection, we still have some artworks that were a part of that first exhibition. And so behind you all, there's Julius Woltz's painting Street Corner, which won second place in the oils category. And Julius was a faculty at UT Austin, also a student of Jose Arba. And then Clyde, if you don't mind showing off for me the piece next to you, Janet Turner's Guinea Fowl. It won first place in the watercolor, tempera, and graphics category. And Janet Turner was a student of Thomas Hart Benton, and she was also head of the art department at Stephen F. Austin. So just from those two artists alone, you're seeing the very high caliber of artists who were submitting applications to this exhibition and who were being selected as prize winners. Okay. Summer of 1952, so just a few months later, the board of directors dropped the name component of Ann School. So it just becomes the Beaumont Art Museum. It's no longer the Beaumont Art Museum School. I think they had decided having that many instructors and that many classes just wasn't viable. And so they would, on occasion, offer classes after that, but it wasn't a component of a formal school, the way that Glassell was the formal art school of the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. President Hoffman, who was the person who put together the Canasta Bridge Tournament, she steps down, so she's only been president for about a year, but she becomes a lifelong influencer for the museum because every spring she puts together the annual exhibition. And then the very long first annual exhibition of the Beaumont Art Museum for residents of Texas has a name change. So originally, of course, right? Originally it was just for residents of Texas, but they changed it to the Beaumont Art Museum Tri-State Annual Exhibition. So it opens up the application to artists living in Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And some of you may recognize those states because that is still sort of areas that the museum continues to focus acquiring artworks from. And then lastly, to kind of round out 1952, in the newspaper clippings, we start to see this area called an art colony. And some of you may think that's sort of surprising because art colonies we often associate with like the Dallas Nine, the Black Mountain College, the New York artists. But this area really considered themselves like an active art colony. And they would invite nationally recognized artists to come and visit during the summer and have summer workshops. And so I saw progressively throughout the archives the writers referring to this community as an art colony, which I thought was really fascinating. In addition to just starting a new museum and having a yearly juried competition, they are putting together 20 exhibitions a year. Right?
What's that doing, you think?
For some of you who don't know, that is a crazy schedule. And those exhibitions are running for 2 weeks at a time in a rented house. So they are just turning exhibition over one after another. They are exhibiting Lamar faculty with their students. They are exhibiting newspaper photography competition winners. Back when the Beaumont Enterprise would actually sponsor a very large prize competition exhibition. They are exhibiting solo local artists, such as Maudie Karen Tanks, whose piece is here to my left, your right. They are exhibiting artists such as Marie St. Lou, who is actually a Frenchman, but he would on occasion stay with the Starks at the Shangri-La Gardens, and he would come to visit, and he would jury competitions here. And these artists are so grateful to have an opportunity to exhibit with the museum and to be a part of this community that they start donating artworks of their own accord. So both of these pieces to my left were donated to the museum to thank the community for having a show of their work. And they're still here in our collection, which I think is so very special. This is also a practice that we still continue here at the museum 75 years later. We regularly try to obtain an artwork from each artist that exhibits with us. It's not always possible. There's a lot of factors that can also stand in the way. But it is something that we try to attempt whenever we can. And that has provided us with a collection that has a rich history of the museum tied to it. So we're going to fast forward a little bit and we get to fall of 1956. We're just in 52. Already, the museum's only been open a few years and they're making major strides. They have this huge ripple effect on the community. And they decide, we want our own place. We don't want to be in this rented house anymore. We think we can do it. So they contact and make friends with Miss Rosina Cabot Brown, who was an art lover, who agrees to donate $50,000 to fund the museum's new 3,000 square foot building. Now, $50,000 is around $591,000 in 2025. And they decide to break ground at 2675 Gulf Avenue in the South Texas State Fairgrounds near Magnolia Park Zoo. And some of you might say, that address sounds relatively familiar. Let's see what you have been. To the current Beaumont Art League location, you are standing in the second location of the Beaumont Art Museum that was built through Mrs. Brown's donation. Interestingly enough, she used the money to hire her son, who was an architect, to build the building. So, you're going to get a little extra drama in this talk. And at the time, the president of the Beaumont Art Museum was Joe Scurlock. And so those two names may also ring a bell, Scurlock and Brown, because they were president and the governor at that time. So on September 15, 1957, again, we've only been open 7 years, the museum moves into the Brown Galleries at Fair Park. This brings us into the 1960s. We are still putting on 20 exhibitions a year. But we have also integrated more programming just to keep ourselves more busy. So the museum begins to offer quarterly seminars. Some of the Lamar faculty lead these seminars, some local artists lead them. They had some very interesting topics like, what is art? And then they would discuss that for 4 weeks. So I wish I could have been there. That would have been so much fun. They also integrated the film club into a monthly program. So the local film club was actually independent of the art museum. They came forward and said, we think you could offer sort of the space we need in order to view our films, and we think it would be super cool if we teamed up together. And so the film club becomes a regular offering at the art museum. And interestingly enough, we have restarted the film club. So if you are interested in joining, you can talk to Miss Hillary, our PR coordinator, about some of the details for film club. In addition, they begin to have fundraisers that are beyond canasta, bridge tournaments, although that does continue to happen in sort of the spirit of the founding of the museum. So by 1963, we have on a yearly basis offered the Tri-State exhibition, and with each exhibition comes purchase prizes, which means we have added to the permanent And so they begin to regularly have an exhibition each year of the permanent collection, which is still something we do here at the Art Museum. So typically during the summer, you can experience our permanent collection exhibition and see pieces that are part of the greater holdings of the museum. The museum is, again, just rocketing forward, doing everything right. And in March 1967, they decide we are ready to expand. Oh my gosh, so quickly. So they talked to Mrs. Brown, who was their original donor, and she donates a second donation of $60,000, which is over $582,000 in today's time. And they expand the fairgrounds location, which is why it's kind of an L shape slash, half of a plus sign. So they have 2 galleries now, and they're so excited. They have their own space, and it is built in order to be a contemporary art space for contemporary artists. The next year, in 1968, they decide to drop the tri-state component of the annual exhibition. And so anyone can apply as long as they pay the membership fee to the Art Museum. And so that sort of opens up the applications for this competition. But at the same time, a lot of the prize winners are still Texas artists, which I think really speaks to the high quality of art that was being made in our state. And this includes prize winners such as John Alexander, who has 2 pieces in this exhibition, Kermit Oliver, who's a very well-known painter. And then to round out the 60s, remember we are doing our 20-plus exhibitions and all our programming, we've already expanded. We get offered a second location by the Cook-Wilsons. And so in 1969, the Cook-Wilson estate is donated to the Art Museum at 1111 9th Street. And so at the beginning of the 70s, we now are split across town in 2 different locations. Now for those of you not familiar with the Cook-Wilson estate, it is still standing. I believe it was for sale in the most recent time period. It may have been purchased by this point, so it is back to being a private residence. Thank you, Christina. It was originally designed by Houston architect John Staub in 1930 in Latin colonial style. So it was kind of his regional take on the styles of homes in New Orleans. It was owned by loyal operator J. Cook-Wilson and his wife Mary Randolph. And once it was acquired by the Art Museum, it became known as the Wilson Memorial Art Center. Now, there were some caveats to the donation of the estate to the Art Museum that the Art Museum did not have previously with owning its own property. So the property at the fairgrounds, they had built that building and they owned it outright. They did rent the land from the city at a very discounted rate. And then with the Cook-Wilson estate, the city becomes more involved with the Art Museum. So the Cook-Wilson family donates the house to the city with the requirement of the Art Museum must inhabit and must have operations within the house. If the Art Museum does not operate within the house, then it returns to sort of the requirements of the will or for it to go to the Episcopal diocese. So it was either one or the other. So the Art Museum trustees say yes. We would love to have a second location. Everything's going great for us. In addition to that, the city must help provide funds for the first paid museum director. So all that time, up to the 1970s, they just had sort of volunteers running the museum who were doing an incredible job. But in the 70s, we see this transition of the museum from being sort of a community-run space to a more regulated institution in line more with national museums than community-run organizations. And the hope is that eventually the museum will be able to get accreditation through the American Alliance of Museums, which is, I guess you could say, similar to being accredited through any other organization you work with, whether it's a university or like the Better Business Bureau. It's a very intensive process. It takes many years. It takes some funds, and there's a lot of requirements that go with it. In addition to the city helping to pay for the first director, they signed a 50-year lease agreement with the museum and charge the Beaumont Art Museum $1 a year to inhabit the house. In addition, the Beaumont Art League and Magnolia Garden Club members get an office to operate out of. So the Art League was still intimately tied with the museum, and Magnolia Garden Club was assisting with the landscaping. This brings us into the 1970s, so we have two locations across town. We have the Fairgrounds location and the Wilson Memorial Art Center, also known as the Cook Wilson Estate. By 1973, the Art Museum leaves the Fairgrounds and they move fully into the Cook Wilson Estate. The annual exhibition, which offered those prize purchases, is also phased out, and instead there are two new ways for the museum to acquire artworks. The first being that the annual members exhibition they had every year now offered a prize purchase. In addition, they put together 3 invitationals, and these were juried invitationals, so they invited certain artists to participate, and then they would have someone jury the invitational to decide which pieces they would purchase for the museum. So the Kermit Oliver painting that we have in the 70s room was one of the purchases from the first invitational. Now, in the 70s, there's only 3 invitationals, and then it stops beginning in the 80s. So we have an invitational in 74, 76, and 78. But by 76, they were planning to expand the Cook Wilson Estate. Remember, we're on quite a roll. Everything has been going right our way. And they decide that in order to pursue accreditation with the American Alliance of Museums, they need more space. They're like storing crates in their kitchen, which is not good for accreditation. I'll tell you that much. So the accreditors actually send a committee out to review the house, and they say, you really got to build onto it. You need like storage hallway, you need to be able to keep things in restricted places. You know, really the house and the way it's set up now is just not quite doing it justice. And so the board of directors go to the city and they say, hey, you've helped us all this time. You helped us get the Fairgrounds location. You've helped us have this really great financial deal so that we can operate out of the Cook Wilson Estate. Would you let us expand the Cook Wilson Estate? And this is where things start to get a little bit tricky. Because technically, the Art Museum was illegally in the Cook Wilson Estate. And that is because the Cook Wilson Estate was a private residence, so it was zoned for, individual family, single person residency. You might say, oh, this is starting to get a little bit exciting. I assure you, all of my information was published in newspapers. And so if you should ever want to look at them, you're welcome to do so. This is not based on any conversations. And so they go to the city and say, we want to expand. In addition, we would like to no longer illegally be in the house, so could you please rezone the house? And the council actually makes sort of a divided decision. They rezone the house so that the museum can technically be in it and operate, but at the same time, they zone it in a way that makes it impossible for the museum to expand on the Cook Wilson Estate. And this is because community members really love the beautiful house, and they didn't want to see the beauty of that architecture diminished in some way through an expansion. And so the city council rezones the house as an architecturally, culturally important space, which meant that the museum could not add on to the grounds because that would change the designation. They also could not change things inside of the house because it was a city building, which meant that they had to have permission from the city in order to change anything. Ultimately, they thought, this might not work out for us, but we're very good at fundraising. We've built our own space at least once. We're just going to find some new land, and we're going to build another new building. In the meantime, of course, still 20 exhibitions a year. They are not stopping that. And they are collecting from artists like Robert Madden, who is very prominent in the Mars faculty member, David Cargill, John Alexander, Dorothy Hood, Robert Levers. All of these artists, very well Texas and beyond. Many of them faculty members at their respective universities, whether it was UT Austin or the University of Houston. They're having exhibits all around the United States. And so they are adding artworks to the permanent collection of very prominent artists of our area and beyond. So now we enter into the 1980s, and we are, of course, getting towards the end of this exhibition, but there's still a lot of excitement. During the 1980s, they exhibited the Gutenberg Bible. They were only one of 6 locations to exhibit it. They have exhibitions of Keith Carter, Paul Manus, Georgia O'Keeffe, and artifacts from all around the world. They also are making plans to acquire 20 acres of land at 3650 Delaware Street, which would potentially become the museum's 4th location. Now, this property is owned by Jefferson County, is where the old tuberculosis hospital used to be. And the city agrees to help the museum with acquiring this space. I'm just going to pause to get a drink of water real quick because I assure you this gets very exciting. Thank you. Thank you. You're welcome. Okay, back to it. The land is owned by Jefferson County, and the city has assured the art museum they will help them find a new property. So the city approaches the county and says they would like to acquire the land on behalf of the art museum. Now you might say, why did the art museum directly work with the county? That's because if the county were to sell the land to the art museum, they would have to open it up to bids to anyone. The art museum might not be the highest bidder. The county doesn't have to open bids to the city. They can just sell it directly to them. So the museum and the city make a deal. The museum will pay the city for acquiring the artwork over 30 years. Thank you. Okay. The museum will pay the city over the course of 3 years for the property, which is worth over $255,000. The county makes an agreement with the city, and this will be very important. If the art museum does not use the property, it will revert to a passive park. A passive park is just sidewalks. There's no buildings or anything like that. So by 1983, the museum pays for the property, and they have raised $3 million towards building a new building. And their goal was $4.5 to $6 million. At the same time, the mayor's construction company wins the bid to build the museum. There is some debate about whether Mayor Neal has crossed the line. And he assures the community it's a done deal, and also, you know, he's not going to fully profit from it. So in winter of 1984, they decide to announce that they will break ground at the Delaware location on March 20th of 1985. At the same time, we're still acquiring artworks from very prominent artists such as Luis Jimenez, Keith Carter, and Paul Manus, and they're some really fabulous pieces. In 1985, we also acquired the Felix Fox Harris acquisition, which was over 120 sculptures by local folk artist Felix Fox Harris, and that space is fully installed with the pieces we own today. It also began the museum's acquisition of folk art pieces. So before that, we weren't really acquiring those pieces, we were acquiring fine art pieces. And you might say, what is the difference with those? So in the United States, fine art is typically prescribed to artists who attend a school in order to study art. So they have formal education in the arts, usually through a college. For folk artists, many times they decide that they want to teach themselves or they learn from family members about creating art. And so there is, in a way, a less formal process, but no less important in terms of quality or subject matter. So, where were we? We were breaking ground, potentially, March 20th of 1985. In early 1985, Ben Rogers approaches the museum, and he offers to donate land downtown valued at $900,000. This is actually the third time that Ben has offered the property to the museum, and twice they have turned him down. But at the time, you can just imagine how he felt about that. So at the time, the board of directors were very invested in having a property on Delaware French Street. However, they were not meeting their fundraising goals. In fact, they only had made enough money to build a space as large as the Cook Wilson estate, which would not suffice because it would not allow for them to receive accreditation. And so they needed funders and backers, or they needed in-kind donations. And so the board of directors met, and with only a month before they were supposed to break ground on the Delaware French Street property, they moved downtown. They decide instead that they will take up Ben Rogers on his deal. It is also bolstered by the fact that the city decides to offer a financial package that will assist the museum to meet its fundraising goals and be able to build the space that they want to in order to have the museum that they desire. Now, this very quick change is not so easily accepted by the community. They are concerned and skeptical. One thing that I learned why they were concerned and skeptical is through our archives and through the Downtown Heritage Society tour, which takes place on the weekends. In the 1940s, there were race riots in downtown Beaumont. And so if we're looking at the difference between the 40s and the 80s, it's only the matter of a few decades. Simple, singular generations. And so people started writing the newspaper and writing the museum. And you can actually see some of those letters in the education gallery where people sent in their comments. And they said, you need a guard to be able to go downtown. I will never exhibit with you again if you move downtown. You will never get another dollar from me if you move downtown. Despite all of this, there was enough people who wanted to move forward because they had the vision of what the museum could be, that they decided to still go downtown. At this time, they still owned the Delaware French property, technically through the city, because they had fully paid it off. And they said, what are we going to do with this property across town? And the city says, well, we'll rezone it. Again, rezoning causes a problem. We'll rezone it so that we can sell it on your behalf. And then that money will go towards the museum. It'll finish out your financial fundraising goal. So they decide unilaterally to rezone the Delaware French property so that 5 acres out of the 20 would be conserved and 15 could be sold to developers. And the museum would make somewhere between $1.2 and $2.25 million off of the sale. Now remember, the community, a little skeptical already about the moving downtown, but then the announcement of the sale of Delaware French property becomes public, and that causes an uproar. The East Texas Nature Club decides to get involved. Particularly, one of the founding members, her husband, is a lawyer. And so they decide, how can we prevent the rezoning of that property? And you and they had observed dozens of bird species roosting or stopping at this acreage of land. And they thought if it was developed, they would lose that opportunity to view those birds and also for those birds to have what apparently is a very important spot for them during migration. The East Texas Nature Club gets enough signatures to try and force the city to rezone the Delaware French property. So to take it from being now the opportunity for it to be sold to developers and return it back to 20 acres that can be sold. Now this is very difficult for the museum because they need the sale in order to make their fundraising goals. And at the same time, the city has already, made a deal and the city has voted on it. By bringing in enough signatures, they forced the city council to have a special vote on a proposition that would either make or break the fundraising goals of the museum. So in August 1985, they decide to schedule the special election. Now there's a few months before this happens, so the city and, not the city, the art museum decides they're going to campaign aggressively. So if you go to the 1985 to 1987, you can see scanned copies from our archives of some of the campaign newspaper clippings. And the museum side was they wanted community members to vote no, do not rezone the property. And they pushed really hard for people to understand their predicament. But some of the issues were people didn't understand, one, why the museum couldn't just go ahead and use the money they had to build on that property. Two, why would they feel like they had to go downtown when everything was moving away from downtown, sort of commercially? They felt it was a lot safer. They felt that people could easily access the Delaware French property, that it was around residential space. And also that, it would be a very beautiful location for the museum because we don't really have a lot of trees around. Now the East Texas Nature Club runs on the proposition hoping you'll vote yes. Yes to rezoning the property, to save the trees and save the birds. And so on August 10th, 1985, it goes to a community vote and the museum loses. The community votes majority in favor of the property being rezoned back to just being, parks with trees. Now this puts the museum in a difficult position because they had hoped to sell that property. Now they're not going to meet their fundraising goals. At the same time, they don't have the money to upkeep the property. The city also does not have the money to buy the museum out of the lease agreement they have on the property. And so instead, the museum goes to their board of trustees and they say, we need to get a different architect. We're going to build a smaller museum. It's still going to be great, but we're going to build it downtown. And so they break ground in 1986. And then in September 10th, 1987, they open at this location, 500 Main Street, which is the beginning of a whole new era for the art museum. If you want to find out what happens to some of these different things, properties, where the museum goes forth after becoming the Art Museum Southeast Texas, you're going to have to come to next summer's exhibition, which will be a legacy of collecting Art Museum Southeast Texas, which will bring us from 1987 to 2026. And you will get to also see rooms that are still divided by decades, see some incredible acquisitions that the museum has moved forward on that are part of our holdings. And you'll get to learn another couple years of history from me, sprinkled with a little bit of drama. But it will bring you up to speed and it will close out our 75-year anniversary celebration. So, I know that was very long. I hope you enjoyed it. And please enjoy the exhibition the rest of the night. Please come back to enjoy it. Bring people to see it. And if you would like to attend any of our additional programming, we have a lot going on here in October. Our really big free family art day, Eat a Bug, is in just a week. Oh my goodness.
Next Saturday.
Next Saturday. our book club is meeting next Tuesday. They are reading Picasso's War. And then on Halloween, if you're looking for something to do, which, a lot of people are, we're going to have a silent disco dance party. And it's going to be around the decades that you see in this exhibition. And if you're not familiar with the silent disco dance party, the great thing is you get to wear headphones. And so there's no ambient music. But if someone's wearing headphones and you're wearing headphones, you could be listening to the same thing or something differently. You're just all dancing and vibing at the same time. So we encourage you to come in your decade-appropriate